First story, Lost Time on Route 66, Arizona, 1990. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that night on Route 66. It was back in 1990, and I was making a long-haul trip from Chicago to LA, the kind of run I'd done 100 times before. I remember it was a crisp autumn night. The air was cool and the stars were out in full force. The road stretched out endlessly before me, a ribbon of black cutting through the desert. I had the radio on low, some old country tune keeping me company as I cruised along. It was around 2 a.m. and I was wide awake thanks to the thermos of coffee by my side. The highway was pretty much deserted at that hour, just me and the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. I was making good time, my rig humming along smoothly. Little did I know that in just a few minutes, my entire world would be turned upside down. I first noticed something was off when I caught a glimpse of a strange light in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just another vehicle coming up behind me, probably some night owl making their way across the country like me. But as I kept driving, I realized something wasn't right. The light wasn't getting any closer, but it wasn't falling behind either. It just stayed there at the same distance, like it was following me. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine, even though I told myself I was being stupid. I mean, what else could it be but another car, right? But as the minutes ticked by, that uneasy feeling in my gut just kept growing. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but I couldn't help glancing in the mirror every few seconds. The light was still there, unwavering, unblinking. And was it just my imagination, or was it getting brighter? That's when things started to get really freaky. My truck, which had been running like a dream all night, suddenly started acting up. The engine began to sputter and cough like it was struggling to breathe. I felt the steering wheel get heavy in my hands, as if some unseen force was fighting against me. Panic started to set in as I realized I was losing control of my rig. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. The dashboard lights began to flicker, and then one by one, they went out. I was sitting there in the dark, my heart pounding, so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. And all the while, that light behind me was getting closer and brighter. I could see it illuminating the inside of my cab now, casting long, eerie shadows across the dashboard. I remember thinking, this can't be happening, this isn't real. But it was happening, and it was all too real. The next few moments burned into my memory like a brand. That light, whatever it was, suddenly intensified to an impossible degree. It was like someone had cranked up the sun and pointed it right at me. The entire cab of my truck was flooded with this brilliant white-blue light. It was so bright that it hurt to look at, but at the same time I couldn't look away. I felt my eyes watering, but I couldn't even blink. And that's when the true horror set in. I tried to move my arms, to grab the wheel, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. It was like my entire body had turned to stone. I couldn't move a muscle, not even to turn my head or wiggle a finger. The panic that washed over me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. I was completely helpless, trapped in my own body as that light engulfed everything around me. I don't know how long I was paralyzed like that. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. All I know is that at some point, I must have blacked out. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The engine was off, and there was no sound except for the soft whisper of the wind outside. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, which was still blurry from that intense light. Slowly, feeling started to return to my body. I flexed my fingers, then my arms, relief washing over me as I realized I could move again. But that relief was short-lived as I took in my surroundings. My truck was parked on the shoulder of the road, the emergency lights blinking steadily. But I had no memory of pulling over. The last thing I remembered was driving, then that light, and then nothing. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard and my blood ran cold. It read 5:47 a.m. That couldn't be right. I'd lost over 3 hours, just gone, vanished into thin air. With shaking hands, I fumbled for the door handle and practically fell out of the cab. The cool morning air hit me like a slap to the face, helping to clear some of the fog from my mind. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the stars fading away one by one. I looked up and down the highway, half expecting to see, well, I don't know what. But there was nothing, just an empty road stretching out in both directions, no other vehicles in sight. I walked around my truck, checking for any signs of damage or anything out of the ordinary. Everything looked normal, which somehow made the whole situation even more unsettling. It was like the universe was gaslighting me, telling me nothing had happened when I knew deep in my bones that something extraordinary and terrifying had occurred. As I circled back to the driver's side, a sudden thought hit me like a punch to the gut. The tachograph. If I had really been driving all that time, it would show the miles I'd traveled. With trembling hands, I climbed back into the cab and checked the readings. What I saw made my stomach lurch. According to the tachograph, I had only driven about 50 miles since my last stop. But that was impossible. At my usual speed, I should have covered at least 200 miles in that time frame. I sat there, staring at the numbers, trying to make them make sense. But they didn't. They couldn't. It was like a chunk of my journey had just been erased, as if those miles had never existed. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the implications of this started to sink in. Where had I been during those missing hours? What had happened to me? I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in my seat, my mind racing with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Had I been abducted? The thought seemed ridiculous, something out of a cheap sci-fi movie, but then again, what else could explain the lost time, the strange light, the paralysis? I tried to recall any details, any fragments of memory from those missing hours, but it was like trying to grab smoke. There was nothing there, just a big black hole where those memories should have been. And yet, I had this overwhelming sense that something had happened, something beyond my comprehension. It was like my body knew something my mind couldn't or wouldn't remember. I felt different. Not in any way I could put my finger on, but there was a lingering sensation of wrongness, as if I had been taken apart and put back together, but not quite in the right order. As the sun began to rise, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and pink, I knew I had to get moving. I couldn't just sit there forever, trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. With hands that still shook slightly, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life as if nothing had ever been wrong with it, which only added to my sense of unreality. I pulled back onto the highway, my mind still reeling from the night's events. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that strange light again. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. Yet the sensation persisted, a prickling at the back of my neck, a weight pressing down on my chest. It was as if the experience had left an invisible mark on me, a beacon that broadcast to something, that I was different now, that I had seen things I shouldn't have. The rest of that drive is a blur in my memory. I remember stopping at a truck stop a few hours later, stumbling into the bathroom and being shocked by my own reflection. My face was pale, my eyes bloodshot and wild-looking. There were dark circles under my eyes, as if I hadn't slept in days. But what really caught my attention were the small, reddish marks on my neck and arms. They looked almost like pinpricks, perfectly circular and evenly spaced. I hadn't noticed them before, and I had no idea where they came from. As I stared at those marks, a wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the sink to keep from falling over. It was like my body was physically rejecting the reality of what had happened to me. I splashed some cold water on my face, trying to pull myself together. But as I looked back up at the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that the person staring back at me wasn't quite me. It was my face, sure, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I managed to finish my delivery in LA, operating on autopilot. My mind was a whirlwind of questions and theories, each one more outlandish than the last. I kept replaying that night over and over in my head, trying to find some rational explanation for what had happened. Maybe I had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. But that didn't explain the lost time, the strange marks, or the feeling of utter wrongness that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. I thought about reporting it, but to who? The police? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. My trucking company? They'd probably take me off the road, worried I was having some kind of breakdown. So I kept it to myself, carrying the weight of that inexplicable experience alone. But it gnawed at me, day and night. I couldn't sleep without seeing that blinding light behind my eyelids. Every time I got behind the wheel, I found myself tensing up, half expecting it to happen again. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of government experiment, or a new type of aircraft being tested. But deep down, I knew that didn't add up. The paralysis, the lost time, the marks on my skin, it all pointed to something far beyond ordinary human technology. I started researching, spending hours in libraries when I was off the road, poring over books about UFO sightings and alien abductions. The more I read, the more I recognized elements of my own experience in other people's accounts. The bright light, the lost time, the sense of being examined or probed. It was all there, echoing my own terrifying night on Route 66. But instead of providing comfort, these similarities only deepened my sense of dread. If what happened to me was real, if aliens had actually taken me, what did they want? Why me? And more frighteningly, would they come back? The effects of that night didn't fade away like I had hoped they would. Instead, they seemed to seep into every aspect of my life, changing me in ways I couldn't fully understand. I started having vivid, terrifying nightmares. In them, I was back in my truck, surrounded by that blinding light. But in these dreams, I could move, and what I saw, God, I can barely bring myself to describe it. Figures, tall and thin, with huge black eyes, reaching for me with long, spindly fingers. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in the middle of my bedroom with no memory of how I got there. It was like my body was trying to run from something my mind couldn't remember. The worst part was the constant feeling of being watched. Even in the privacy of my own home, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, studying me, assessing me. I'd catch myself checking over my shoulder, peering out windows, always half expecting to see something not human. My work started to suffer. I couldn't focus on the road, constantly distracted by every flicker of light in my mirrors, every strange shape in the sky. I'd find myself taking longer routes, avoiding that stretch of Route 66 where it all happened, even if it meant adding hours to my trip. My boss started to notice, questioning my longer delivery times and the dark circles under my eyes. I made excuses. Insomnia, stress, anything to avoid telling the truth. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the concern. I knew it was only a matter of time before I lost my job, but I couldn't bring myself to care. It all seemed so trivial compared to the cosmic horror I had glimpsed. I started to withdraw from friends and family, unable to explain what I was going through, afraid they'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. There were moments when I wished I could just forget it all, go back to my normal life. But then, I'd look at those small circular scars on my arms, faded now but still visible, and I'd know that there was no going back. Whatever had happened that night had changed me forever. As the months passed, my obsession with finding answers only grew stronger. I started attending UFO conventions, support groups for abductees, anything that might help me make sense of my experience. I met others who claimed to have gone through similar ordeals. Some of their stories resonated with me, while others seemed far-fetched, even to my now open mind. But there was a common thread among all of us, a sense of having been marked, chosen, for some unknown purpose. We were like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to each other in a vast, uncaring ocean of disbelief and ridicule. I found some comfort in these communities, in not feeling so alone. But at the same time, each new story I heard, each theory I explored, only seemed to open up more questions. The more I learned, the less I felt I understood. And always, there was that nagging fear in the back of my mind. What if they came back for me? What if next time I didn't come back at all? It's been years now since that night on Route 66, and I still don't have any real answers. The memories haven't become any clearer. The lost time remains a mystery, and the scars have faded to almost nothing. But the experience has left an indelible mark on my soul. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the constant feeling of being slightly out of step with the rest of the world. I still drive trucks, but I'm more cautious now, always alert for anything out of the ordinary. Sometimes on long night drives, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the sky. A light moving in ways that defy explanation, a shape that shouldn't be there, and I'll feel that old familiar dread creeping up my spine. But there's something else there too, a sort of grim curiosity. Part of me, a part I'm not entirely comfortable acknowledging, almost wants it to happen again. Just so I can know, once and for all, that I'm not crazy, that what happened that night was real. I've never spoken publicly about my experience before. This is the first time I'm sharing my story in detail. I know there will be skeptics. People who'll say I dreamed it all up or that I'm just looking for attention. And honestly, there are days when I almost wish they were right. It would be easier to believe I'd imagined the whole thing than to live with the reality of what it means. Because if what happened to me is real, if there really are beings out there with the power to stop a truck on a lonely highway, to take a person and return them with no memory of what happened, well, it changes everything, doesn't it? Our place in the universe, our understanding of reality itself. I don't know if I'll ever get closure, if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me that night. But I do know this: the world is stranger and more terrifying than most people realize. There are things out there, just beyond the edge of our perception, that defy explanation. And sometimes, on dark nights when the stars seem just a little too bright and the shadows a little too deep, I find myself looking up at the sky and wondering, are they watching me even now? And if they are, will they ever come back to finish whatever it was they started on that lonely stretch of Route 66? Second story, the Interstate 80 abduction, Nebraska, 1985. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on Interstate 80. It was back in '85, and I was hauling a load from Nebraska to California. The night was clear, stars twinkling above like tiny diamonds scattered across black velvet. I'd done this route countless times before, so I was on autopilot, my mind wandering as the miles rolled by. The radio was playing some old country tunes, and I was tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, just trying to stay alert. It was around 2 a.m., that dead time of night when the world feels empty and anything seems possible. I remember checking my watch and thinking I should pull over soon for a coffee break. That's when I first noticed it, a light in the sky brighter than any star. At first I thought it might be a plane, but something about it seemed off. It was moving too fast, too erratically. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there, and it was getting closer. The light grew larger and brighter as it approached, and I realized it wasn't just a single point of light, but an elongated shape, like a massive glowing cigar, hanging in the sky. My heart started racing, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't normal, not by a long shot. I've seen all kinds of aircraft in my years on the road, but nothing like this. It moved silently, which was the eeriest part. Something that big should have made some kind of noise, but there was nothing. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up even the hum of my engine. I thought about pulling over, but some instinct kept my foot on the gas. Maybe I thought I could outrun it, as ridiculous as that sounds now. The thing kept pace with me effortlessly, gliding above the highway like some kind of ghostly dirigible. Then, without warning, it positioned itself directly over my truck. The cab was suddenly bathed in an intense white light that seemed to penetrate everything. It was so bright it hurt to look at, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. That's when things got really weird. The dashboard of my truck started going haywire. Lights were flashing on and off. The radio started emitting this high-pitched whine, and then my headlights just died. I was doing 70 on a dark highway with no lights. But before I could even react, I felt it. It started as a tingling sensation, like when your foot falls asleep, but it quickly spread throughout my entire body. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was intense, like every cell in my body was vibrating. I tried to lift my hands off the wheel, to reach for the radio or the door handle, anything. But I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, a passenger in my own body. The tingling intensified, and I had this bizarre sensation of being lifted, even though I could still feel the seat beneath me. My vision started to blur, the edges growing dark. The last thing I remember is a blinding flash of light and then nothing. Just darkness and silence. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The engine was off, and the highway was completely deserted. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I blinked, trying to clear my vision and make sense of what had happened. The cab was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, still in the ignition. I turned them and the engine sputtered to life, headlights cutting through the darkness. I sat there for a moment, just breathing, trying to calm myself down. That's when I noticed the time on the dashboard clock. It read 4:37 a.m. I'd lost over 2 hours. 2 hours that I couldn't account for, 2 hours that had vanished into thin air. I ran my hands over my face, feeling the stubble on my cheeks, trying to ground myself in reality. But nothing felt real anymore. With trembling hands, I reached for the logbook and the tachograph. I needed to make sense of this, to find some explanation for the lost time. As I flipped through the pages, my blood ran cold. According to the tachograph, I'd traveled over 150 miles further than I should have, but that was impossible. Even if I'd been driving at top speed for those 2 hours, I couldn't have covered that much ground. And I knew I hadn't been driving. I'd been somewhere else. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Something had happened to me, something I couldn't explain or understand. I felt dizzy, nauseous, like the world was spinning around me. I stumbled out of the cab, needing fresh air, needing to feel solid ground beneath my feet. The night was cool. A light breeze rustling through the trees lining the highway. I looked up at the sky, half expecting to see that strange light again, but there was nothing but stars. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the cool night air. It was the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. I whipped around, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there, just empty highway stretching out in both directions. But the feeling persisted. It was like being watched by 1,000 invisible eyes, scrutinizing my every move. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. My skin crawled, and I had to fight the urge to jump back in the truck and speed away as fast as I could. But where would I go? How could I outrun something I couldn't see or understand? I forced myself to take deep breaths, to try and calm the panic rising in my chest. But with each breath, I felt like I was inhaling fear itself, like the very air around me was tainted with an otherworldly presence. I eventually managed to drag myself back into the cab, but sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that blinding light, felt that eerie, tingling sensation. I drove through the rest of the night in a daze, jumping at every shadow, every flicker of light on the horizon. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I felt a small measure of relief, but it was short-lived. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't just the lost time or the inexplicable mileage. It was something deeper, a shift in my perception of reality. The world around me seemed slightly off, like I was viewing it through a distorted lens. Colors seemed too bright, sounds too sharp. I found myself questioning everything, wondering if what I was seeing and experiencing was real. The next few Days were a blur of sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. But the evidence was there. The tachograph readings, the lost time, the lingering sensation of being watched. I tried to rationalize it, to come up with some logical explanation. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and somehow stayed on the road. Maybe the tachograph was faulty. But deep down, I knew these explanations were just desperate attempts to deny the truth. Something had happened to me that night, something beyond my understanding. The nightmares started almost immediately. Vivid, terrifying dreams of being trapped in a sterile white room, surrounded by shadowy figures with large almond-shaped eyes. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, sheets tangled around me, my heart racing. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The feeling of being observed never went away, always lingering at the edges of my consciousness. As the weeks passed, I tried to return to my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every night on the road became an exercise in terror. I'd find myself constantly scanning the sky, my heart leaping into my throat at every distant light or passing aircraft. I started taking different routes, avoiding Interstate 80 altogether. But it didn't matter. The fear followed me wherever I went. I became jumpy, irritable, prone to outbursts of anger or panic. My colleagues noticed the change, asking if I was okay, but I brushed off their concerns. How could I explain what was happening to me? I was losing weight, dark circles forming under my eyes from lack of sleep. But worse than the physical toll was the mental anguish. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, replaying that night over and over in my mind, trying to remember something, anything, that might explain it. But there was always that gap, those missing hours that haunted me. About a month after the incident, I started experiencing strange physical symptoms. It began with headaches. Not just ordinary headaches, but blinding migraines that would leave me incapacitated for hours. Then came the nosebleeds, sudden and violent, often waking me from my fitful sleep. I'd find myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror at 3 a.m., blood streaming from my nose, my reflection looking more gaunt and haunted with each passing day. But the worst was the marks. One morning, I woke up to find a series of small circular bruises on my arms and chest. They were perfectly round, almost like puncture marks, but I had no memory of how I got them. They faded after a few days, only to reappear in different locations. I started wearing long-sleeved shirts, even in the heat of summer, terrified that someone would notice and start asking questions I couldn't answer. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. I found myself questioning my sanity, wondering if I was losing my grip on reality. Every unexplained sound, every shadow in the corner of my eye sent me into a panic. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some relief, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the whole truth. Instead, I talked vaguely about stress and anxiety, about feeling watched and having nightmares. She prescribed medication, but it didn't help. If anything, it made things worse, dulling my senses and making me feel even more vulnerable. I started researching, spending hours online reading about UFO sightings and alien abductions. Some of the stories I found chilled me to the bone, mirroring my own experience in ways that were too specific to be coincidence. But for every account that seemed credible, there were dozens that were clearly hoaxes or the ravings of disturbed minds. Was that what I had become? Just another crazy person with a wild story that no one would believe? As time went on, my life began to unravel. I couldn't concentrate on work, constantly distracted by my fears and obsessions. I started making mistakes, missing deadlines, getting into minor accidents. My boss called me into his office one day, concern etched on his face. He told me I needed to take some time off, get myself together. I wanted to argue, to insist I was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief that I wouldn't have to face the open road and its terrors for a while, but terror at the thought of being alone with my thoughts, with nothing to distract me from the memories and fears that plagued me. I went home that night to an empty apartment, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. As I sat on the edge of my bed, head in my hands, I wondered if I'd ever feel normal again, if I'd ever be able to shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed that night on Interstate 80. During my time off, I became increasingly isolated. I couldn't bear to be around people, their normalcy a stark reminder of how much my life had changed. I spent most of my days holed up in my apartment, curtains drawn, obsessively checking and rechecking the locks. I started keeping a journal, trying to document everything I could remember about that night and the strange occurrences since. Pages filled with disjointed thoughts, sketches of the cigar-shaped craft, and descriptions of my nightmares. Looking back at those entries now, I can see the descent into paranoia, the way my handwriting became more erratic, the pages smudged with tears and sweat. I stopped answering calls from friends and family, unable to face their questions or concern. The few times I ventured out for groceries, I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every passing car, every overhead plane sent my heart racing. I'd find myself ducking into alleys or behind buildings, trying to escape the imagined scrutiny of unseen watchers. One night, about 3 months after the incident, things came to a head. I was tossing and turning, trapped in another vivid nightmare. In the dream, I was back in my truck, but the highway stretched endlessly before me, twisting and warping in impossible ways. The cigar-shaped craft hovered above, its light growing brighter and brighter until it was all I could see. I felt that familiar tingling sensation, more intense than ever before, and then a searing pain in my head. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, to find my nose bleeding profusely. As I stumbled to the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror that made my blood run cold. My eyes, usually dark brown, were glowing with an eerie greenish light. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, certain I must be hallucinating. When I looked again, they were back to normal, but the image was seared into my mind. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my bedroom, a baseball bat clutched in my trembling hands, convinced that at any moment they would come for me again. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. The fear, the isolation, the constant state of panic, it was killing me slowly. I needed answers, even if those answers terrified me. I started reaching out to UFO research groups, hesitantly at first, then with increasing desperation. Most dismissed me as just another crackpot, but a few seemed genuinely interested in my story. One researcher, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Hayes, agreed to meet with me. She listened without judgment as I poured out my story, nodding and taking notes. When I finished, she looked at me with a mix of sympathy and excitement. "You're not alone," she told me. "There are others who've had similar experiences. We might be able to help you recover more memories, to understand what really happened that night." Part of me was terrified at the thought of delving deeper into those missing hours, but a larger part desperately needed to know the truth. I agreed to undergo hypnosis, hoping it might unlock the memories hidden in the recesses of my mind. The hypnosis session was scheduled for a week later. As I lay on Dr. Hayes's couch, her soothing voice guiding me into a trance state, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. At first, nothing happened. I recounted the events leading up to the sighting, the strange light in the sky, the tingling sensation. But as Dr. Hayes pushed me to remember more, something shifted. Suddenly I was back there, but not in my truck. I was in a stark, white room, lying on a cold metal table. Shadowy figures moved around me, their features indistinct, but their eyes, those large black almond-shaped eyes, unmistakable. I felt a scream building in my throat, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, helpless as they loomed over me. There was a bright light, a humming noise, and then pain. Searing, white-hot pain that seemed to penetrate every cell of my body. I thrashed on the couch, my body reliving the trauma my mind had suppressed. Dr. Hayes tried to calm me, to bring me out of it, but I was trapped in the memory. I saw flashes of strange instruments, felt phantom sensations of prodding and poking. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. I snapped back to reality, gasping for air, my clothes soaked with sweat. The aftermath of the hypnosis session left me more shaken than ever. The recovered memories, if that's what they were, haunted me. They were vivid, terrifying, but also fragmented and confusing. I couldn't be sure if they were genuine recollections or some sort of fabrication, born from my fears and the power of suggestion. Dr. Hayes was excited by what she called a breakthrough, but I felt more lost than ever. The nightmares intensified, now featuring detailed scenes from the White Room. I started experiencing intense flashes of déjà vu, triggered by the most mundane things. The hum of a refrigerator, the smell of antiseptic, the feeling of cold, metal against my skin. Each time, it would transport me back to that table, to those probing eyes and invasive instruments. I found myself questioning everything, my memories, my perceptions, even my own identity. Who was I now? The man I had been before that night on Interstate 80 seemed like a stranger, a character in a story I'd once read but could no longer relate to. In the months that followed, I tried to piece together some semblance of a normal life. I returned to work, forcing myself back onto the road despite the constant fear, but things were never the same. The highway, once my second home, now felt alien and threatening. Every mile was a struggle, every night a battle against the urge to pull over and abandon my truck, to run and never look back. I found small comfort in online forums and support groups for abductees, but even there, I felt like an outsider. Many seem to have found peace with their experiences, even embracing them as some sort of spiritual awakening. But for me, there was no peace, no acceptance, only a gnawing uncertainty and a deep-seated fear that never truly went away. To this day, years later, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the night sky for that ominous light. The incident on Interstate 80 may have lasted only a few hours, but its impact has stretched across decades, reshaping my life in ways I'm still struggling to understand. I don't know if I'll ever have all the answers, if I'll ever fully comprehend what happened to me that night. But I know that I can never go back to the person I was before. That man is gone, lost somewhere in the vast, terrifying unknown that now defines my existence. Third story, a trucker's final haul. Interstate 5, California, 1994. It was supposed to be my last haul before retirement, just a routine drive down Interstate 5 in California. I'd done this route more times than I could count, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. The sky was clear, stars twinkling above like they always did on those long, lonely stretches of highway. I remember checking my watch. It was just past midnight, and I was making good time. The radio was playing some old country tune, and I was tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about how I'd be home soon, ready to hang up my keys for good. That's when I first noticed it. A bright light in the sky, way off in the distance. At first I didn't think much of it. Could have been a plane, maybe a helicopter. But something about it just didn't sit right. It wasn't moving like any aircraft I'd ever seen. It seemed to hover, then dart around erratically. And as I watched, it started getting bigger, like it was coming straight for me. My heart started racing as the light grew closer. It was so bright now that it was hard to look at directly, like staring into the sun. But the weirdest thing was the silence. You'd expect a big, bright object like that to make some kind of noise, especially as it got closer. But there was nothing, just that eerie quiet you get on the road late at night. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just some kind of weather balloon or maybe a military test. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. That's when the buzzing started. It wasn't loud at first, just a low hum that I could feel more than hear. But it grew stronger, vibrating through the cab of my truck until my teeth were chattering. I tried to speed up to get away from whatever this thing was, but that's when everything went haywire. The engine sputtered and died, even though I was going full throttle. The lights on my dash flickered and went out. I was coasting down the highway in total darkness, with that thing getting closer by the second. Panic set in as I realized I was completely helpless. I tried to steer towards the shoulder, but the wheel was locked tight. My foot was jammed on the brake pedal, but it might as well have been made of stone for all the good it did. The buzzing was deafening now, drowning out even the sound of my own terrified breathing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The truck, the buzzing, even time itself seemed to freeze. I couldn't move a muscle, couldn't even blink. It was like I was trapped inside my own body, a prisoner in my own skin. The light was all around me now, so bright that it should have been blinding, but somehow I could still see. That's when I noticed the shadows moving outside my window. They weren't human shapes, that's for sure. Long, spindly limbs and bulbous heads that no earthly creature could have. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was completely paralyzed. All I could do was watch as one of those things reached out towards my door handle. I don't know how long I was frozen like that, staring at those impossibly long fingers as they wrapped around the handle of my truck. It could have been seconds, minutes, or hours. Time had lost all meaning. The door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the unnatural silence. I felt a chill run down my spine as something cold and alien touched my arm. My mind was screaming, begging my body to react, to fight back, to do anything, but I remained motionless, a helpless spectator to my own abduction. The creature, I still can't bring myself to call it an alien, even though I know that's what it was, seemed to study me for a moment. Its eyes were huge dark pools that reflected no light, no emotion. I felt like I was being dissected, examined from the inside, out, and then without warning I was moving, It wasn't like being carried or dragged. It was more like floating. My body was limp, unresponsive, but I was drifting out of the truck cab and into the air. The light was everywhere, pulsing and swirling around me. I could see the highway. Below, my truck looking tiny and insignificant. Other cars were frozen on the road, their headlights cutting through the darkness but not moving an inch. It was like the whole world had been put on pause, and I was the only one still experiencing time. As we ascended higher, I caught glimpses of other figures, more of those tall, spindly creatures, moving around with an eerie grace. They seemed to be performing some kind of task, but I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Everything was too alien, too far removed from anything I'd ever experienced before. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut it all out, but even that simple action was beyond my control. The next thing I remember clearly is being in some sort of room, if you can even call it that. The walls, floor, and ceiling all seemed to be made of the same shimmering, translucent material. It was like being inside a giant soap bubble, with colors and lights constantly shifting and changing. I was lying on some kind of table or platform, still unable to move. The creatures were all around me now, their long fingers prodding and probing. I couldn't feel pain exactly, but there was a sort of pressure, a sense of intrusion that went beyond the physical. It felt like they were examining my very thoughts, sifting through my memories and experiences like they were flipping through the pages of a book. I tried to communicate, to ask what they wanted, why they had taken me, but no words would come. In my mind I was screaming, pleading for answers, for release, for this nightmare to end. But outwardly, I was as silent and still as a statue, powerless to do anything but endure whatever was happening to me. The examination, or whatever it was, seemed to go on forever. I lost all sense of time in that strange, shimmering room. The creatures moved around me in a choreographed dance, their movements fluid and precise. At times, they would bring objects close to my face, things that looked like a cross between surgical instruments and high-tech gadgets from some sci-fi movie. I couldn't tell if they were using these devices on me or just showing them to me. But each time one came near, I felt a strange tingling sensation throughout my body. It wasn't painful, but it was deeply unsettling, like every cell in my body was being rearranged. I tried to focus on something, anything familiar, to keep myself grounded in reality. But everything around me was so utterly foreign, so completely beyond my understanding that I felt myself starting to lose grip on what was real and what wasn't. As the creatures continued their work, I began to experience flashes of something. Memories maybe, but not my own. I saw landscapes that couldn't possibly exist on Earth. Purple skies with multiple suns, oceans that glowed with bioluminescent life, cities that seemed to be alive and breathing. These visions would come in rapid-fire bursts, overwhelming my senses. I couldn't tell if they were trying to communicate with me, show me their world, or if this was some side effect of whatever they were doing to me. The strangest part was that with each vision, I felt a growing sense of understanding, as if some vast cosmic knowledge was being downloaded directly into my brain. But as soon as I tried to grasp onto any specific piece of information, it would slip away like smoke through my fingers. The feeling of simultaneous enlightenment and confusion was maddening, and I found myself silently begging for it to stop, even as another part of me yearned to see and understand more. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more when I felt like my mind was about to shatter under the weight of these alien experiences. Everything changed. The creatures stepped back, their dark eyes fixed on me with what I could swear was a mix of curiosity and something else. Satisfaction? Disappointment? It was impossible to read their expressions. The shimmering walls of the room began to pulse more rapidly, the colors swirling faster and faster until they blurred into a blinding white light. I felt a sensation of movement again, that same floating feeling from before. My stomach lurched as if I was plummeting downward at incredible speed. I wanted to close my eyes, to brace for impact, but I was still paralyzed, forced to watch as the white light gave way to darkness, then to the familiar stars of the night sky. The ground was rushing up to meet me, and for a terrifying moment, I thought they were going to drop me from a great height, leaving my broken body as a warning or a message. But the descent slowed, and I found myself gently lowered back into the cab of my truck. As soon as I was back in my seat, the paralysis lifted. I gasped, sucking in air like I'd been holding my breath for hours. My hands flew to my face, my chest, my arms, desperately checking to make sure I was all in one piece. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed inside me. The clock on my dashboard was blinking 12 Dao, like it does after a power outage. I fumbled for my watch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read the time. 3:47 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed since I first saw that light in the sky. I looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the craft or the creatures, but the highway was empty. Just the usual late-night traffic, a few cars zipping past as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I tried to start the truck, half expecting it to be dead, but the engine roared to life immediately. The radio came on, playing the same country station as before, like I'd just pulled over for a quick nap. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a dream, some kind of hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But the residual tingling in my body, the flashes of alien landscapes still flickering at the edges of my vision, told me it was all too real. I thought about calling the police or maybe trying to flag down another trucker, but what would I say? Hey, I think I was just abducted by aliens. They'd think I was drunk or high. Hell, I almost wished I was. At least then I'd have an explanation for what I'd experienced. With shaking hands, I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. I needed to get to my destination to complete this final haul. Maybe if I just focused on the familiar routine of driving, I could make sense of everything else later. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made me flinch, half expecting to see that unearthly glow again. It wasn't until I reached my delivery point that I realized something else was off. The sun was already up, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I checked my watch again, 7:23 a.m. That couldn't be right, even accounting for the 3 hours of lost time during the incident. I should have arrived much earlier. I'd made this run countless times. I knew exactly how long it took. I pulled out my logbook, thinking maybe I'd made a mistake in my initial time entry. But when I opened it, I froze. The pages were filled with strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They shimmed and shifted as I looked at them, sometimes resembling letters or numbers, but never staying still long enough for me to read them. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. What the hell was happening to me? I managed to make my delivery, going through the motions on autopilot. The warehouse guys must have noticed something was off because they kept giving me weird looks, but nobody said anything. I was grateful for that. I had no idea how I would have explained my state of mind. After finishing up at the warehouse, I knew I should head home. But the thought of trying to explain to my wife why I was so late, why I looked like I'd seen a ghost or worse, was too much to handle. Instead, I found myself pulling into a rest stop just off the highway. I needed time to think, to try and make sense of what had happened to me. As I sat there in my truck, staring blankly at the steering wheel, the full weight of the experience started to hit me. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, and I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. It wasn't just fear or shock. It was like my entire reality had been shattered and poorly glued back together. I kept seeing flashes of those alien landscapes, hearing echoes of that bizarre humming sound. And worst of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had changed. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but I just felt different, like I was wearing someone else's skin or looking at the world through a warped lens. As the day wore on, I tried to piece together what had happened. I checked my phone, hoping to find some news about strange lights in the sky or other truckers reporting weird experiences. But there was nothing. It was as if the world had gone on turning, completely oblivious to the mind-bending encounter I just had. I even tried calling a few fellow drivers I knew who might have been on the road that night, but they all said the same thing, just another quiet night on I-5. Was I going crazy? Had I imagined the whole thing? But then I'd look at my logbook, with its indecipherable symbols, or catch a glimpse of an otherworldly scene in my peripheral vision, and I knew it had been real. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep right there in the cab of my truck. My dreams were a chaotic mix of highway roads morphing into alien corridors and those long-fingered creatures reaching for me from the shadows of familiar truck stops. I woke up with a start, momentarily disoriented. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I'd slept the whole day away. As I rubbed my eyes and tried to gather my thoughts, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the inside of my left wrist, was a small, intricate pattern of dots and lines. It looked almost like a tattoo, but I knew with absolute certainty it hadn't been there before. I scrubbed at it frantically, but it didn't smudge or fade. It was a part of me now, as permanent as the memories of what had happened. And that's when I realized this wasn't over. Whatever those beings had done to me, whatever purpose they had for abducting me, it wasn't finished. This mark was proof. A reminder, maybe even some kind of tracker. The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. I wanted to run, to hide, to somehow make myself invisible to whatever was out there watching me. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. If they could stop time and pluck me off the highway like it was nothing, what chance did I have of escaping them? It's been weeks since that night on I-5, and I still haven't told anyone the full story. How could I? Who would believe me? I've gone back to my normal life, or at least I've tried to, but nothing feels the same anymore. Every night, I find myself staring out the window, watching the stars with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The dreams haven't stopped. Sometimes I wake up with new symbols on my skin, always faded by morning but undeniably there. I've started keeping a journal, trying to write down everything I can remember, but the memories are slippery, like trying to hold on to water. I don't know what they did to me up there or why they chose me. All I know is that my last haul on Interstate 5 was just the beginning of a journey I never asked for and don't understand. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking up at the sky, almost hoping to see that light again. Because as terrifying as it was, at least then I'd know I'm not crazy. That what happened to me was real. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally get some answers. But for now, all I can do is wait and wonder and hope that someday I'll understand why my final drive turned into something I could never have imagined.